The post-war American-led world order was neither post-war nor American-led nor very orderly. Please discuss. The title for my remarks, which appears in the literature here, Why Restraint is Conservative, emerged from I know not where. The idea is almost a tautology. Revolutionaries are excessive, liberals expansive. Conservatism, almost by definition, implies restraint. Conservatism cautions us that we hardly know ourselves, and so it obviously mortifies any presumption that we fully understand the Donbass. But I hope this afternoon not just to mortify our ambitions and prove to you that water is wet. I hope also in these brief remarks to mortify those who come in here and throw around the word isolationist, or, as we heard yesterday, MAGA isolationist, as if this were a spell word from Harry Potter capable of disarming you of your constitutional inheritance. But first, the water is wet bit. An American conservative case for a humble foreign policy has its roots in a Republican founding. Republics maintain their independence through a policy of neutrality rather than imperial and religious alliances. When John Adams said, the United States does not go abroad in search of monsters, he was not just describing a practical foreign policy for a young republic, but stating something about our Constitution. It gives us no global mandate or mission, and we'll return to that point as I come to an end today. The foreign policy practice that emerged to complement and guardian our young republic was the Monroe Doctrine, which holds that we would reject imperial intrusion into our hemisphere, and we would opportunistically eject the existing imperial powers from the same. And I have to say, Trump's instincts are mostly in line with this. We see it in his trade policy, which is checking the expansion of China's commercial penetration of other parts of the Western Hemisphere with the accompanying political demands that go along with them. We see it even in his desire to purchase Greenland, removing the Dutch as perhaps the last and least threatening of the old world's major landholders around our territory. We see it in the fact that he, more than any president since Eisenhower, has insisted on European contribution to its own defense, and that America will not let these Cold War alliances draw us deeper into European internal brawls, but enable us to escape them. This is reflected in his desired outcome that Europeans take the lead in securing a post-war Ukraine. To this traditional American foreign policy, Trump also adds a Jacksonian element, well summarized by Bill the Butcher in Gangs of New York, the spectacle of fearsome acts. Soleimani invoking the big red button, quote, obliterating Iran's nuclear sites. But he does not follow through on these with bigger commitments of American troops on the ground or regime change or regime management. The great conservative statesman feared the corruption of imperial power and governance. I dread our own power and our own ambition, wrote Edmund Burke. I dread our being too much dreaded. We may say that we shall not abuse this astonishing and hitherto unheard of power, but every nation will think we shall abuse it. It is impossible but that sooner or later this state of things must produce a combination against us which may end in our ruin. He hated the opportunism and avarice of rule at the imperial peripheries. Quote, what passes for a government in India is basically a loosely organized group of young men on the make who come there with an aim to make their fortunes as quickly as possible by whatever means available and then return to England. He could have been talking about Hunter Biden sitting on the board of Burisma, or any of the so-called Atlanticists who are now lavishly paid to consult on anti-corruption boards in Ukraine today, paid more than their Ukrainian counterparts to take away control of Ukrainian resources from a Ukrainian democratic public. Burke believed the habits of arbitrary rule exercised at the peripheries of the empire would return to the home front. Again, he could have been talking about the digital surveillance pioneered in the War on Terror and then turned on veterans or homeschoolers or traditionalist Catholics back home. Or more absurdly, the diversity consultants who were sent to create gender-neutral terms in the language of Pashto in Afghanistan, who then come home and work for a DEI bureau of a major financial institution where they debank you for visiting the wrong websites or saying the wrong things on your social media account. Our opponents insist on calling us isolationists or MAGA isolationists. And a few hardy conservatives have tried to appropriate the slur. William F. Buckley Jr. did as a young man when he named his sailboat Sweet Isolation in 1938 as a tribute to his father. It was a play on the phrase splendid isolation, which described the British policy of avoiding permanent alliances, and which also happened to coincide with the longest peace in Europe's history, from the end of the Napoleonic Wars to World War I. The theorist of naval supremacy, Alfred T. Mahan, used the term isolationist as a pejorative in the 19th century, but it didn't catch on until the 1930s, and it exploded in use during the war and after World War II. There were endless calls in the 1940s to somehow end American isolationism. I saw a recent newspaper clipping shared by ne'er-do-well Curtis Yarvin from 1942 showing a picture of Methodist Bishop McConnell, an influential progressive clergyman who, in describing the post-world order that should come about, described the abandonment of American isolationism and the immediate strong limitations on natural sovereignty. His thoughts were typical of his type, and notice how naturally the two ideas go together: ending isolationism and restricting sovereignty. What isolationism turns out to be is a word of the brains trust, or the managerial elites, or the blob. In the great parable of good and evil that they have made, isolationism is what forever morally disqualifies the American people from exercising the constitutional role assigned to them by the founders of controlling American foreign policy through the House of Representatives and its war power. Instead, isolationism uses that to morally qualify the clerical caste that gathers around the executive, where war powers are slowly leaked away from us and away from accountability. And we see this rhetoric deployed almost all the time. In fact, just yesterday, the Washington Post, after 2 tidy paragraphs describing the horrors of World War II, the editorialist wrote, "The lessons to many Americans seem self-evident. Isolationism, nationalism, and authoritarianism led to disaster. Alliances, free trade, and democracy are the only way forward, and the U.S. has to take the lead." Now, the Cold War was a time which many conservatives treated as an aberration. Robert Taft, contemplating the astonishing growth of communism in the war's wake, wrote an entire book, A Foreign Policy for Americans, trying to adapt traditional American foreign policy principles to what he viewed as the extraordinary and aberrant emergency threat of communism. He insisted on congressional authority and no preemptive guarantees to go to war. And this is why Article 5 is ambiguous in the NATO treaty. In 1952, Bill Buckley said that the exigencies of the Cold War required big government for the duration. It was big government that we would otherwise not tolerate. Naturally, when the Cold War ended, there was a debate on the right about the future of foreign policy, and the best of this was in the national interest between figures like Pat Buchanan, Jeane Kirkpatrick, and Charles Krauthammer. Buchanan argued for America first, second, and third. Kirkpatrick that we should be a normal country in normal times. Krauthammer, who de facto won the debate politically, took up the side of the progressive Bishop McConnell. In one sense, Krauthammer and other neoconservatives could make an argument that the post-Cold War order was a conservative achievement. These institutions were built for us at great price and sacrifice by our fathers. They provide us with innumerable public goods that we don't sufficiently appreciate. Expanding on them will enhance this American-led order, and if the triumphal mood music of the 90s foreign policy wasn't enough to help this argument carry the day, institutional inertia assured its triumph. But Krauthammer was clear-eyed, more clear-eyed than I think the Washington Post was this week. In a sense, isolationism would always threaten this arrangement. That is, the return of the people who still had the power to get angry and disappointed enough with a foreign intervention and to force Congress to bring conflict to the end, even if just by defunding it. Charles Krauthammer wrote then, "I am proposing the politics of the fiber optic cable. As the industrialized democracies become increasingly economically, culturally, and technologically linked, they should begin to think about laying the foundations for increasingly binding political connections. This would require the conscious deprecation not only of American sovereignty, but of the notion of sovereignty in general." He moved on to cite the positive example of the EU coming together as a model for a super-sovereign West of the United States, Europe, and North Asia. Krauthammer understood what the Post writer does not understand. You cannot have economic integration and security integration and simultaneously democracy. The political freedom of a self-governing people must also mean the ability of that people to choose when to enter into trading relations and when or whether to join or exit a war. Perhaps Krauthammer did not understand what he was abolishing in democracy in the name of saving it, but we cannot plead ignorance in 2025. When last year Romania's elections were canceled by the courts and then backed by European authorities who promised to do the same in Germany if the result was displeasing, they were acting according to Krauthammer's logic of super sovereignty, which supersedes the national constitution. We cannot plead ignorance when our State Department and other covert organs are interfering against populists in Europe by interfering with their free and fair elections. We cannot claim ignorance when the machinery that is trying to build this super sovereignty did everything it could to stymie Donald Trump in his first administration and to prevent him from getting a second one. The founders of this nation put the war power in the House of Representatives for this very reason, to keep it close to the people whose blood and treasure were on the line. From this day forward, when you hear the word isolationist, you must understand that its function is only to deprive you of your constitutional inheritance, a self-governing people's total stake in the nation's foreign policy, and as a defense of the usurpation of this by a court of intellectuals in think tanks, magazines, the Kennedy School, and just a few floors above us. I'm with Jeane Kirkpatrick's conclusion of that debate. There is no mystical American mission or purpose to be found independently of the U.S. Constitution and government. There is no inherent or historical imperative for the U.S. government to seek to achieve any other goal, however great, except as it is mandated by the Constitution and adopted by the people through elected officials. Restraint isn't just the wisdom of Republican theory. It's not just the best of America's normal conservative traditions. It is also your constitutional prerogative and birthright. Its fate is inextricably tied up with our belief that a government of, by, and for the people shall not perish from this earth.